Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and we talk about whether you hanged a picture or hung a person. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're talking about the Mutiny on the Bounty. And considering I'm from Hawaii, I'm from the Pacific Islands, and I studied crime and punishment in the 18th century, this is like right in the middle of the Venn diagram of things I like and am interested in, so I'm really excited to do this. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to our patrons who voted for this series. You make our work possible really now more than ever, and we're part of the Nebula First program. If you want to head on over there, you can see our first episode on William McKinley, also a series that deals with the Pacific and kind of the fate of the Pacific. And I did want to mention, if I sound a little bit different, I had nasal surgery. I had sinus surgery not too long ago. I'm not fully recovered, but pretty much recovered. I'm fine, don't worry about it. But if you have a history of sinus problems and you start having weird eye symptoms, maybe get that looked at, because I didn't realize that I was having so much problems that it was affecting my sight. So, recommended reading for this series is The Bounty, The True Story of the Mutiny on the Bounty by Caroline Alexander. Really great book that just kind of gives you an overview. The Truth About the Mutiny on HMAV Bounty and the Fate of Fletcher Christian by Glenn Christian, who's a descendant of Fletcher Christian. He offers kind of an interesting perspective that the mutiny was mostly about food, the availability of food, the restriction of food, which I thought was fascinating. So we put a little bit of that in the show. Reading the Bodies of Bounty Mutineers, which is one article from The Bounty from the Beach, Cross-Cultural and Cross-Disciplinary Essays, edited by Sylvie Legaud-Ortega. This is part of a number of academic articles that we consulted on this one. You can find the rest linked in the description. Let's get on with some general things. A lot of people mention that you can't say the HMS Bounty because HMS stands for His Majesty's Ship. You would be saying the His Majesty's Ship Bounty. I mostly ignored this grammatical rule. I try to have a conversational tone in the show. So like, technically, yes, but also HMS is not the bounty. It is HMAV, His Majesty's Armed Vessel Bounty. So really, when we talk about, so you can say mutiny on the bounty, but not mutiny on the HMS Bounty. But yeah, I try and keep things conversational when we do naval stuff. I don't necessarily try and mix in too much naval jargon or patterns of speech because I want to keep it accessible. Speaking of that, we had a lot of comments that you hung laundry, but you hanged a person. That you can't hung a person. I'm going to answer this as someone who wrote my thesis on Georgian crime and punishment, and particularly religious rituals surrounding execution. I don't really care about this rule. First of all, it's not an actual rule. Both are grammatical. Both are fine. There are a certain amount of people that really heavily prefer hanged and believe that this is like actually a hard and fast rule. It's not. Both are common usage. Both are correct usage. However, I wanted to bring this up because if you look up in Merriam-Webster like about this, the entry literally says there is nothing wrong with saying hung, but so many people are probably going to bother you about it that you should just use hanged, which I love that as an entry. Sorry for using it even though it was, correct, but, I just hope that some of you didn't get too hanged up about it. Sex in the Pacific Islands. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's been some pushback, some scholarly pushback on some of these assumptions about, for example, the role that the availability of sex in Tahiti played in the mutiny. I'm generally on board with this. I think that, and the reason I say that is because, I studied 18th century British crime and punishment. That means looking at the sex trade, and it's not like sex for specifically money is unavailable in 18th century London. It is very out front and prominent, much more than today. In fact, go read Boswell's London Journal. there's some spicy stuff in there. So when I kind of like read this argument, it immediately convinced me, because I was like, yeah, because from my side, it's like, yeah, London is full of the sex trade, and it's very out there, and it's not like these things are unattainable, in England, in port cities, especially around places where sailors kind of congregate. So I think there is a lot more going on. Kind of the older a version of the story is, the more it kind of plays on that angle. And even there was a recent book that I didn't put in recommended reading because I think it plays way too much into this angle. It really kind of tries to plus up the kind of sex and violence aspects of this story, which I think is not quite the right direction. I think it has more to do with experiencing something outside both the British class system and specifically the Royal Navy's very restrictive hierarchy. We talked about the story of the HMS Dolphin in our Exploring the Pacific series. We did a short on it. I ran across an article after we had done those, talking about how this whole thing may be a myth, this idea that the Dolphin had to leave because sailors were pulling too many nails out of it to try and trade it for sex with Tahitian women. And that even if it is true, which it is not super widely attested to, we don't understand necessarily the Tahitian side of this. We're basically taking one side of this interaction and saying like, oh, well, we know what was going on during this interaction, that this was, sex trade, like nails for sexual favors. Whereas like Tahitian women could have seen this as a courtship ritual. They could have seen it as sort of just a gift of appreciation. Like we are all also talking about a society that doesn't operate by like capitalist mercantilist values, right? So it was saying like people need to stop telling this story as this like kind of funny anecdote. Like we don't even know if it really happened in that way, or it may have been blown up. Or so that's a really good thing. I wish I had read the article before, because this is a story I kind of like grew up with, right? Learning about Europeans in the Pacific. Patron question from Bo Carey. Can you elaborate more on the British class system? The title of social classes, who was top and who bottom, which class did midshipmen and young gentlemen come from? This isn't a wrong question to ask, but it's just such a big topic that I can't cover it sufficiently. You could take multiple college level courses on this specific topic and how the class system changed over time. And you could very specifically just do like British class system in the 20th century or the 18th century. And a lot of it is a little bit vibes based, I think maybe a way to put it. To kind of like talk about the hugeness of this question, there was a joke when I was in college that my British history professor, who was my advisor, used to tell in class, which is class is to British history what race is to American history, in that like how race has shaped American history is hard to even like fathom. It's such a deep topic. And the same is true in British history, right? And that the idea of like, if you're doing something that involves a historical question or an incident in British history, you should always look for a class angle, because often there will be one, or class will be playing some kind of role. The easy version of that question, the latter part, is that like, yeah, midshipmen, these young gentlemen who it was presumed that they would later become officers, are gentlemen. And what that means essentially is that someone is of the nobility. They have some kind of heritage, could be far back, that is connected to the nobility, or they have family in the nobility. It's not just based on money. You do have some people who, James Cook is one of them, who kind of comes up through being a warrant officer, right? That do end up kind of part of this class, but that is often an exception. And there is this idea of like gentlemen being spiritually like different than ordinary people, and there are different modes of address for them. There are different behavioral rules when you're interacting with them if you are from a lower class, or even if you have more money than them, but you are not of that class. So it's something that's really difficult for us to kind of understand the totality of today, even if you're British today, because a lot of that broke down, particularly in the 20th century, and Victorian era too, but specifically in the 20th century after World War I. But it still exists, but not in the same way. If you want a fun way to engage with this, go read the Richard Sharp books. They're awesome. They're about a rifle officer in the Napoleonic Wars who gets promoted to being a lieutenant and ends up making his way up from the ranks. But the fact that he came up from the ranks is a regular point of conflict with other officers who believe he's not really a gentleman and doesn't belong. You can also, you kind of need to know what you're looking for and be prompted. But if you watch the movie Master and Commander, which is a fabulous movie, probably the best movie about the Royal Navy, go look at how the midshipmen who are like 13, 14 years old are behaving with adult sailors who are under their command, despite the fact that they are young and probably know a lot less. And you very clearly see the class difference in like how they speak, because how you speak has a lot to do with like what class you're perceived as part of. But there are also like different markers of class, whether it's clothing, particularly in the military, right? Now you have like a captain's uniform that is, if you're in the US military, right, a captain's uniform is not that different from someone who's like a sergeant, like the pins are different. In dress uniform, it might be a little bit different, but everyone has very similar styles. This is not true in the 18th century, right? Anyway, I went on about this too long. Again, huge topic. But go watch Master and Commander, go read Sharp. I'm sure we will return to this at some point. Patron question from Gage Hardesty. Some of the art displayed the bounty on the east edge of Tahiti, modern-day French Polynesia, instead of the west side. Since Bligh went east across the southern part of Africa, was that an art accident? We had some early versions of this, and I want to shout out how amazing Allie's art was in this entire series. Just she did a fabulous job, and really brought this subject to life. Some of the initial maps, because the description of it is kind of difficult, right? When they're trying to go around, and they can't. They go back. So they try to go around South America. They can't. They end up going around the long way. So some of the initial maps were not correct. We had to redo them. Some of the later things were like slipped through and weren't redone, like just where the ship was. But I do want to say that they were mostly in Matavai Bay, which is on the northern side of the main island of Tahiti, which is in French Polynesia now. YouTube question. It's an interesting thing how much the British Empire was about moving plants around. Breadfruit in this story, but cinchona, orchids, rubber would all be their own stories of travel and terrariums, right? And coffee. And of course, in episode 3, we talk about how the Pandora survivors end up on the ship going back to England that's full of plant and zoological samples for Joseph Banks again. But it's not just taking a plant one place and taking it to another place. It's also kind of creating a European acceptable environment in other places. So like I live in Hong Kong. You look at early pictures of Hong Kong, like from the 1840s and 1850s, it is super barren. There are not that many plants there. And one of the reasons that, the imperial government is like, yeah, sure, whatever, have this place, is just nothing on it. There's a few fishing villages. There's some people who make incense, like that kind of thing. But what the British end up doing is they end up planting a lot of stuff on Hong Kong to make it more hospitable. So if you hike in Hong Kong now, it's like very woodsy. A lot of those plants weren't there. It was just scrub before. Fun fact, Bligh is well known in Australian history here for a different episode. After the bounty, he was governor of New South Wales and the only Australian governor to be overthrown with violence. A mutiny broke out amongst soldiers wanting to control the rum trade that Bligh was suppressing. He was found under his bed and imprisoned by the soldiers. So my original plan was that the one-off that would follow this series would be on the 1808 Rum Rebellion. And I thought, oh, this is such a great opportunity because We have guest writers that we've worked with before that, one who lives in New Zealand, and I have friends that are writers that were interested to live in Australia, or that are Australian. And I thought, this is perfect. Like, we can get someone from the area to write this. That I don't have to do it. They probably have insights that I don't have. Unfortunately, all of them were busy. So we ended up doing the Tuskegee Airmen episode anyway, which I think came out so fantastic. SVP did a great job. Ali did an amazing job on the art. So I'm not sad about it, but we might do that episode in the future. So I'm not going to talk about it too much. Sorry to nitpick, but Spithead isn't down in Cornwall. Plymouth, which is a naval base, is on the Devon-Cornwall border. However, Spithead is further east, part of the Solent, the channel that runs between the Isle of Wight and the southern England mainland. Spithead is close to Portsmouth, which is the permanent home of HMS Victory. And if you ever go to Portsmouth, if you ever get a chance, go. The Victory is amazing. Mary Rose is amazing. And people sleep sometimes on HMS Warrior. Go see HMS Warrior. It is such a cool vessel. It's the first ironclad. It never, it was one of those ships that was revolutionary and that was immediately, made obsolete. So it didn't participate in any action. But it is just so fascinating to look at. And it's just a big steampunk coolness. It's so neat. I really like HMS Warrior. I was just blown away. I went 20 years ago, but I was just blown away when I went aboard, where I was like, why didn't anyone tell me about this? Episode 2. A lot of people talked about the audio bugs at 151 and 550. Sorry about this. It wasn't in there when we reviewed the episodes, but something happened during the upload. We've looked into some various options on it. It might end up just staying, unfortunately, but we'll see what we can do. When can we get Angry Coconut merch? Pretty fun idea, maybe not a bad idea. The story of the hatred between Bligh and the ship's carpenter Purcell, the one Bligh drew a sword on after they were set adrift, could be a book in itself. Both very stubborn men, both very good at their craft. Yeah, we went into this a little bit with Peter Heywood, but I think one of the ways in popular culture, and you see this with the movies that have been made about the Bounty Mutiny, is that characterizing this as a clash between Christian and Bligh ignores the fact that this is like, it's not like two men with this strained relationship. It's really more of like a bar brawl where, like, even when people have broken into mutineers and loyalists, right, there are this like web of resentments and ways that people who are theoretically on the same side still don't like each other and are still having difficulty. So yeah, and I think that is a large part of but frequently even nonfiction, depictions of this are very Christian and Bligh focused. Though again, you just read into it and you find out that it's a much more complicated mess, really. Though there are authors that say, and I would tend to agree a little bit, that like if you don't have those specific two men of Christian and Bligh, then this mutiny doesn't happen. I think that's possible. Episode 3. The moral of the story is it's important to have a great PR campaign and relatives in high places that will get you off of a mutiny charge with maybe a couple of bribes for testimony and a royal pardon so that you don't embarrass the family. I wanted to talk about British tattooing. For a long time, it was assumed that the Royal Navy had learned tattooing from Tahitians and Hawaiians, and that this had like filtered back to the British Isles. This turns out to not be true at all. This is something that we've learned more about in the last 20 years or so. It's expanded a lot recently, specifically because of people looking at the descriptions, the physical descriptions of people who have been transported to Australia during this period, right? Which is something that starts happening. And there are all these physical descriptions of tattoos, right? Whether it's words, whether it's a star, right? And actually, even in the descriptions of the bounty mutineers, there are all these things that are very clearly not Tahitian. There are some that are described as Tahitian, but others that are like a star. That's not a thing in Tahitian tattooing, right? Though we actually don't know that much about Tahitian tattoos because even when they have, when like Banks or others were drawing Tahitians and Hawaiians at this time, frequently they don't draw them with tattoos. And often they wouldn't even draw them with native clothing on. It's quite an odd thing. Like sometimes they'll have them in these big, kind of almost African drapes and things like that. We're like, oh, it doesn't look very Tahitian. So there is a little bit of idealization even in the pictorial depictions of them, right? That are supposed to be preserving what they look like when they get their portraits painted or whatever. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. People did really associate it with criminality because one way of identifying whether someone had been convicted of a crime before and would have a worse sentence the second time was to tattoo them. And often branding was a thing too. You would be branded like with a T on your thumb if you were a thief. No one wants to cut off their thumb, obviously. But that could be through tattooing as well. But when you look at these records of men who are transported, because they want to make sure that the John Smith they're putting on the transportation boat here is the John Smith that gets off, right? In Australia, they are listed with tattoos. But people's bodies were not documented in the 18th century in the same way there are today. Today we have like photographs, we have written descriptions of people's physical characteristics a lot. You don't have that much, except for criminals then. So that's kind of like, the assumption is that this was more widespread than we thought, but it's really only being mentioned in these descriptions of transportees' bodies. HMS Pandora has been found, speaking of physical evidence, and they were able to identify the bodies of some of the bounty mutineers that died on it by descriptions of injuries that they had suffered and seeing that on the skeletal remains, which is both neat and kind of quite sad. Last thing, I want to talk about some Fletcher Christian conspiracy theories. People really did think that Fletcher Christian was like out there particularly Christianizing the Pacific Islands, and I really do think that's based on his name partially, right? If you read 18th century really fiction or nonfiction or even like satire, they do the thing that like we really associate with Charles Dickens, right? Where people are given names that, shows their role in the story or is somehow indicative of their moral quality, like Fagin, right? In Oliver Twist. Or Oliver Twist himself, right? He's sort of twisting our idea of the poor, of like poverty and virtue. And these were very heavy-handed, very heavy-handed. You have pamphlets where, some woman is named like Mrs. Makewell or whatever, to show that she's, been good at cooking or something like that. So I am convinced that his name really starts to create this impression that he's like out there being some Christian king in the Pacific Islands somewhere. But there's a book in 1831 while Peter Heywood is still alive, he dies in 1831, claiming that Christian has been spotted back in England, that he's back from his wanderings in the Pacific, and he got recognized by Peter Heywood. And I really think that the leniency they end up showing to the final bounty mutineer is partially based on this like imagined idea of what Christian's time and his men's time in the Pacific Islands is like. Yeah, people have this like Robinson Crusoe vision of him at the time. And then there is some like weird parallelism too, because, they find the final guy and he has been teaching people to read the Bible and stuff like that. So, by the way, a lot of the women on Pitcairn so badly did not want to be there that they tried to build a raft and escape, and it didn't work. Some of them died trying to escape. So it's we could have done a whole nother series on the Pitcairn stuff, though that starts to get more contentious because it's like whose story you believe versus this or that, or it's another layer of obfuscation. Coming up on Extra History, William McKinley, American Empire. I'm very excited about this series. McKinley is a really interesting figure in that he himself as a person is not that interesting, but he ends up at this very pivotal time in American history. And it's not necessarily something he set out to do, but he's the guy who turns America into a country that is going to be an imperialist power beyond what it considers its borders, right? It already is an imperialist power, but like they thought of like, oh, manifest destiny, that all just should be ours anyway, right? But it's actually a little bit controversial at the time, this idea that America is going to take over Hawaii and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and start pulling the strings in Cuba. I think you'll find it a really interesting. There's some tariff stuff there too. I think you'll find it very interesting. After that, a history of mass deportation. We'll talk about this a little later, but we go through the history of the use of deportation from the very beginning of the United States all the way to 1954, which is the Eisenhower program, Operation, I'll just put it on screen. But it's very relevant. It's very interesting. It's also a lot of stuff about like the economic relationship between the US and Mexico, because Mexico was also all in on these deportation programs, both in the 30s and the 50s. And then Ancient Egypt. We are going to do an Ancient Egypt series. It should be up for vote now. So join the Patreon. You can help shape the future of our series. And I'm just going to quickly do an Ibn Battuta side trip. I am not at home. I'm in Vancouver right now with my family, visiting some family that lives here. That's why I have beautiful snow-capped mountains, which are blowing my kids' minds because they're from Hong Kong and they don't really see that. And of course, this city is named for George Vancouver, another explorer of the Pacific, who was also James Cook was his main mentor, right? He served under Cook in some of Cook's Pacific voyages. And I think it's so interesting, like Bligh and Vancouver, both of whom really took Cook as their model for like how to be a leader. And they just have such different outcomes because they're different people. And Vancouver captures a little more of that like Cook spirit and is more successful as a result, whereas Bligh just can't. And for some reasons that are not his fault, like the vessel isn't large enough. He is not enough of a highly ranked commander to have a party of Marines, which probably would have stopped this mutiny dead, right? But clearly, throughout his life, there are other incidents. But I just find it so fascinating. I think someone could write a really good tandem biography of Bligh and Vancouver, which kind of shows like one failing to live up to that legacy and one more or less succeeding. One day we will do a Cook series, I swear. My father was obsessed with Cook. I grew up with like Cook prints, original prints in the house of like Native Hawaiian weapons and, helmets and stuff like that Banks drew. And he's a fascinating figure and not necessarily as heroic as he's often portrayed, but a very consequential person. And when we do that, I hope you'll join us. Please join us next week for William McKinley.
All right, Zeliad's Architecture, T. Earl Grey Cold, Lotus Wolf, Kuyakoi, Joseph Blame, Hunter Z, Dominic Valenciana, and Angela Valenciana. You tell me where all that legendary generosity came from on Patreon. Oh, it was you? Oh, thanks.